Hi, modern art class. You just did a lot of reading. Lesson 2 is really long, so I'm going to keep this quick. We're going to do a very, very fast lightning speed review just to remind you of the images on the study guide and kind of give you a sense of the pattern that this lesson follows and some of the main ideas. So we started out this lesson with early photography. We talked about the way that photographs were both influential on painters and sculptors and also kind of scary to them. One of the first formats of photography that we talked about is the daguerreotype, which was invented by Louis Daguerre. This was a quite slow process, started out being several hours, eventually got down to about 20 seconds, but it was a process where you could make a single image on a metal plate, and this is one of the really early ones. This is a cool one, probably taken out of a window, and you can see it looks like an empty street, but in fact, if you look right here, a person was captured. There's probably two people here. This is a man getting his shoe shined. We can't really see the person doing the shoe shine. But that man, see, you can kind of see the type of suit he's wearing. He may be one of the first people ever in a photograph, and he doesn't even know it, which is pretty cool. So anyway, the daguerreotype process, the shutter speed was so slow that things didn't show up unless they were staying still. There would have been carriages and people. This would have been a crowded street. But because this is such an early version of photography, people are moving and they don't end up really appearing in the photo. Before too long, the daguerreotype process gets improved and it gets a lot quicker, and you start seeing photographic studios pop up all over the place. This is a great example of the kind of daguerreotype photograph that you see a little bit later, and this one was taken in America at a studio of a man named Samuel J. Miller. He's not a particularly historically important photographer, but he owned an early photography studio. The man in this photo is more historically significant, Frederick Douglass, who of course is an important writer, thinker, activist, and eventually an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. So anyway, Frederick Douglass was a celebrity at the time, and he sat for this daguerreotype. It probably took about 20 to 30 seconds for the image to appear, so you can almost see him like trying to stay still. Daguerreotypes became something that almost anyone who could afford it would get one of themselves or of their family members. It really changed the way we thought about images, now that we could have photographs of ourselves to pass down to our children or to look at our children when they're away and so on. I went a little out of order here, sorry. This is the next one. So as photography moves forward, one of the things that's really interesting is that photographers, they don't really know what photographs are supposed to look like. Photography is a new medium, so photographers are actually kind of copying painting for a while. One photographer that I really love who does that is Julia Margaret Cameron. She was a British photographer during the Victorian era, and she made these photographs that were mostly of her family members, but she would stage them in these very dramatic, beautiful scenes, and she'd do this kind of blurry lighting that you can see, and she really tried to make these photographs look like romantic era paintings. You can kind of tell what sort of painting she liked when you look at this. Oftentimes, she would have people playing out scenes from Shakespeare or from myth or from other literature. So she's really thinking of the role of the photographer kind of like a painter who's just using these new techniques. At the time when this came out, some people criticized it because it was sort of blurry. People thought that photography had to be crisp. That's what made a good photographer. But her, Julia Margaret Cameron, she instead really was treating this like a painting and trying to create a mood. One thing about this that I think is important is that Julia Margaret Cameron's work and many other photographers from this period show us that photographs really weren't about telling the truth. I think sometimes we think that way, that a photographer's job is to show us an accurate depiction of reality, at least back then. But even some of the earliest photographers were staging things and changing them and basically doing Photoshop, but, in this very time-consuming Victorian way. Another really good example of that kind of early version of Photoshop is Oscar G. Raylander's piece, The Two Ways of Life. Raylander was known for a technique called combination prints, where you could take photographs, many, many photographs, in this case about 30, and then do a quite complicated, technically difficult process where you could print them all as a single photograph. He's basically doing a collage, but he's actually printing the photos together. So it's not cut and paste. They appear as though it's a single photo. In this one, you see a very complicated scene, more complicated than he could have captured in a photograph. It's almost like a painting. We talked about this one a lot in the readings, and it's this whole complex allegory about the meaning of life and what kind of choices you make, and basically the kind of topic that a history painter from maybe the neoclassical period would take on. So with Ray Lander and with Julia Margaret Cameron, and those two happen to know each other, they're both using photography kind of the way that painters used narrative painting. Then we moved on to talk about the realist movement in France. I'm going to actually start with this one. Sometimes people get confused with the word realism and they think, well, photographs are realistic. But realism, particularly French realism, is a specific painting movement, so it doesn't apply to photography. All that French realism really indicates is the idea that the artist is trying to tell the truth. So it's not about it looking like a photograph. And if you look at this, it's not that realistic in like a photographic way. It's more about the idea that the artist isn't editing things out. If you think back to the Romantic era, the Romantic style of painting that we looked at last lesson, they were always exaggerating. They always made things more exciting, more dramatic. The realists, like Courbet here, they wanted to go in the opposite direction and just show things how they are. So this is a funeral. Usually in an image of a funeral, it would be very dramatic and everybody would be mourning and you would see, maybe even an image of a saint or the soul floating up to heaven or something like that. There'd be a lot of drama and excitement and feeling in it. This, on the other hand, just looks like an actual outdoor event where people are, getting distracted, staring off into space. Some people are crying. Some people seem like they're gossiping. There's a dog that wandered up. It's just how it would actually look. So it's much more of a unedited, real picture of what was happening. People like Gustave Courbet, they felt that painting should teach people what's actually going on in the world. And in order to do that, they made a rule for themselves that they couldn't change things, that they had to almost act like cameras. So realism, French realism, is actually kind of related to photography. I know it doesn't look like it, but photography basically taught the French realist painters that just showing life how it is can be interesting, that you don't have to exaggerate or make things more dramatic the way that the Romantics did. Rosa Bonheur is another well-known realist painter. This is one of her many animal paintings. She's especially well known for her very beautiful paintings of animals. She's a realist painter in the sense that she just shows us exactly what's going on. Courbet, on the other hand, he's also showing us exactly what's going on, but he's doing it with kind of a political motivation. Courbet was always trying to make people look at poverty and what it's like to be a regular or poor person in France at the time, whereas usually all of the paintings were either of the aristocracy or they were really exaggerating the lives of the middle class or the poor. So Courbet had kind of a political agenda with his realism, and that's fairly common. But Bonheur really didn't. She was more just using the technique of realism just to show you exactly what the world was like. I forgot one. Oops, sorry. Okay, here, I went all out of order here by mistake. Here's the third realist image that we were looking at. Now, this, of course, is a lithograph. That's a kind of printmaking. And this is by Honoré Daumier. He's another artist from the French realist style who, like Courbet, was very politically motivated. He actually was a political cartoonist. Now, this isn't really that cartoony, but he did caricature-type cartoons as well. This was showing the results of a violent clash between French soldiers and just people who were in Paris. And in this case, French troops came in and murdered everybody in the building as a way to try and get rid of some people that they felt were conspirators against the government. You can read more about that. That's the short version of the story. But the main point I want to make here is that Daumier was really trying to draw attention to the horrible things that were happening in his society. So he's using realism to get people to think about what he thinks is important. He ended up doing political cartoons that strongly criticized the king. He even ended up in jail for it. So he's probably the most politically brave, I guess, the artist who took on the most risk of the realists that we looked at. All right, so because I went kind of out of order here, I'm just going to remind you, for our French realists, we've got Daumier, Courbet, and then also Rosa Bonheur. Then we've got Edouard Manet. Now, you have a video about this to watch in your readings. You probably already watched it. So I'm not going to tell you too much about the details, but the main thing I want to remind you is that Manet was kind of right between realism, the French realist style, and then the impressionist style. He's somebody who really, really pushed the boundaries of what art was supposed to look like. There's certain aspects of the realist style here in the sense that he, for example, with this nude figure here, isn't making her an exaggerated, beautiful Venus figure or a nymph or someone from, some piece of literature. She's just like a regular woman sitting there just staring at us, which is quite unusual. Now, nudes were not unusual, but they were usually mythologized, meaning they were made to look like somebody from an important story or something like that. So that part of it is in the tradition of people like Courbet or Bonheur. But Manet is also somebody who really started the path towards painting becoming abstract. And I know it doesn't really look it when you first glance at this, but this is kind of one of the first abstract paintings. You can see him intentionally breaking rules of perspective, like this lady being too close, not blending in his brushstrokes, letting the body be really flat, having almost no careful shading. There's a little bit of shading, but not too much. So again, y'all already watched a video on this, but the kind of bullet points are that this piece ended up being both a scandal because it was a unexaggerated depiction of a nude, and it showed a scene that people thought maybe was immoral. The fact that this woman is sitting here with these two clothed men. But more than that, it was an important piece because it really started intentionally breaking the rules of art that people had been following since the Renaissance. And it didn't worry as much about trying to look like a room that you could walk into or look like a window you were looking out of. Instead, it just wanted to be a painting. It was okay with being flat. It was okay with having parts that weren't exactly finished and polished. So all of that is moving art in the direction of something much more abstract, which we'll see in the coming weeks. Then at the end of class, we looked at a completely different movement, although it's from around the same time, which is called the PreRaphaelites. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of kind of conservative artists. They were trying to go back in time a bit and bring back a style that came from before the Renaissance. They're called Pre-Raphaelites because Raphael was a Renaissance artist. Here you see a fairly typical example. They use quite bright colors. It's a little bit flatter than some images we've seen. That's one of those Pre-Raphaelite characteristics. And there's lots of very, very meticulous detail. Oftentimes the subjects are Christian or otherwise moral. And here's one more from William Holman Hunt, the Hireling Shepherd. And he's another Pre-Raphaelite. All of those same things apply. Look at that beautiful grass. All these little tiny details, the very bright colors, and again, the moral kind of theme. This one's an allegory. Read about it in your written lecture, just because I'm running out of time here. But remember, the story has a particular moral message, and it's talking in part about the Christian church. Okay, so I am out of breath. I have to go drink a glass of water or something, but that's our quick review. See you soon.